Okay, welcome everyone. I hope everyone's kind of coming into the webinar now. I'm here today. My name is Mo Wise. I'm from Irvine Ranch Water District out in Southern California. And I'm really happy to be hosting these lunch and learn sessions. Today I'm with Angela Burrow. And I just wanted to give you a little background of her, who she is and what we're going to be hearing about today. So Angela is a postdoctoral associate at Cornell University, where she is investigating the impact of forest and wetland change on amphibians through a multiple stressor lens. And Angela earned her PhD in forestry and natural resources in 2021 from the University of Georgia, where she investigated how disturbance and plant community change in the aquatic and terrestrial environment affect threatened amphibians. And a critical part of Angela's work is evaluating the effectiveness of restoration and management actions for the conservation of amphibians. And today she's going to be talking about her work regarding to that. And I'd like anyone who has a question to please put their questions in the Q&A section. There's like a little chat box that you can add. And at the end of her talk, we'll resume those questions before we tie it all up. So go for it, Angela.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And I want to thank all of you for attending today's webinar. So we're going to talk a little bit today about does restoration work? And specifically, does it work for amphibian conservation? So before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that my work has taken place on the traditional homelands of the Muskogee, Creek, and Gayacono peoples, whose ancestors and current members have a connection to the lands that are now the southeastern and northeastern United States. I would also suggest that you learn more and perhaps support these peoples and their current struggles for justice and equity by visiting the Native American Rights Fund using the QR code on the screen. And if you're not quick enough to grab that, this will be available later recorded. I'd also like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, PEO International, and the Savannah River Ecology Lab for their financial contributions to the work that I'll be presenting today. So as a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today, first we're going to just go over what is a geographically isolated wetland exactly, and why should we care about these habitats. I'll touch briefly on their history, a little bit of regulatory status, and amphibians specifically. Then I'll talk a little bit about the motivation and methods for the work I'm going to talk about today. And then that work is broken into some of the main approaches for restoration in geographically isolated wetland habitats for amphibian conservation. And then reviewing some of the evidence that restoration actually benefits those populations. And then I'll go over some recommendations for both practitioners and researchers working in these unique systems. So geographically isolated wetlands are very unique habitats, and the naming and definitions of them can be quite contentious. But for today, we're going to just use this definition with these four main points, which is the definition that was used in the review paper that what we're talking about today is based on. So these are aquatic habitats that are surrounded by uplands. They encounter or undergo frequent wetting and drying cycles. So often that's annually, but it may be slightly less or slightly more than annually. They have minimal to no surface water connections to other waters, so meaning they don't necessarily have strong groundwater or overland stream water connections, and they typically don't support fish populations. I say typically because sometimes there can be fish introduced into these wetlands, say during a flooding event or other ways. So there's a lot of different wetland types that fall into this broad category. So think of things like playas, vernal pools up in the northeast, prairie potholes out west, some lime sinks, or Carolina bays, which are frequently found in the southeast. All of these habitats fall under the umbrella of geographically isolated wetland. As I mentioned, though, the name is a bit contentious, and so is the definition, because the general idea is trying to distinguish these habitats from other wetlands that have a strong connection to flowing waters. So they're not actually isolated, and that's why the name can be contentious. As you can see in this diagram, there's a lot of flow, both water flow from over land, intermittent streams, both into and out of these wetlands. There can be sometimes some upwelling and groundwater connection. And then, of course, there is the biotic connection. So both plants and animals are not constricted to a single area. And so through their movements, we are able to see a very strong connection, both between these individual wetlands with other wetlands of the same type and with the surrounding landscape. Unfortunately, wetland losses are very high in many parts of the world, and around 60% of this historical wetland loss was driven by drainage for upland cropland. Those wetlands that were drained were mostly what we now term geographically isolated wetlands. So just a little bit of slightly swampy land that was sometimes dry and sometimes wet. And farmers often wanted to drain that so that they could increase their yield. So they had a lack of protections historically, and that combined with that generally smaller size has resulted in a really high rate of destruction, particularly for this kind of wetland. Also, conversion to more permanent ponds was quite frequent. So say, a farmer, same situation, instead of converting it to cropland, dug it out a little bit deeper so that there would be a stock pond. And that's not providing the same services as a geographically isolated wetland. I'll just note really quickly that the figure you're seeing here is for all inland wetlands, and not all inland wetlands are geographically isolated wetlands. So these habitats provide numerous benefits to nature and society. And despite those historical losses and continued weak or non-existent protections, initiatives, including the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and this year's World Wetlands Day theme on restoration, have spurred a lot of interest in restoring these valuable ecosystems. And today we'll be focusing on restoring these habitats to benefit biodiversity, most specifically amphibian biodiversity. So geographically isolated wetlands are hotspots for amphibian breeding and reproduction and development of those young. So those frequent wetting and drying cycles that I mentioned can limit fish predators, and that ensures a rich, albeit temporary, nursery habitat for many of these globally threatened species, which you're seeing on the screen now, as well as a large number of common species. Besides being integral components of wetland and forest ecosystems, many of these amphibians are iconic species, so they have also high social value, despite not belonging to the warm and fuzzy mammal club. There is a renewed focus on wetland restoration, and as many of you probably know, restoration was the theme of this year's World Wetlands Day. And I think the time really is now to ensure that those historical wetland losses and degradation are reversed. But it's also essential that restoration doesn't just result in captivating before and after photos, but self-regulating systems that support biodiversity. But geographically isolated wetlands present a unique challenge to restoration. First, geographically isolated wetlands have hydroperiods, so that's that wetting and drying cycles, that are hard to replicate if after they've been disturbed or altered, particularly if they've become permanent through removing, say, soil and making that pond permanent. Also, amphibians are a challenging species to work with because they don't usually live in the pond. They live in the uplands and they use the pond to breed. And so it's not like plants where you can just put the plant there and come back year after year and check on how it's doing. Amphibians require much longer and more intensive work to ensure that the restoration is effective for them. And for that reason, or both of those reasons, for amphibian-centric restoration of these habitats, a lot of the work has been very species, region, or project specific, making it difficult to evaluate in a broad scale way what kind of actions are actually benefiting amphibian conservation. And that also creates a dispersed literature, with some being in the practitioner aimed journals and some being in research-oriented journals, and not a lot of communication between the two. So that provided our motivation for completing this review, because we wanted to provide an overview of the main approaches for restoring these habitats with an amphibian-centric lens, so specifically for those pond breeding amphibians. We also wanted to review the evidence that restoration in these habitats actually benefits those populations, as well as provide those recommendations for researchers and practitioners that I mentioned earlier in the outline. So the guiding theme of our review was to find any restoration project or research that included any metric of amphibian success, because what we were anecdotally seeing is a lot of restoration work in ponds or wetlands that was not including an amphibian component. So you can see there the broad search string that we used. We used Web of Science as our main search engine, but we did look specifically in a few select journals, things like Restoration Ecology and such, for additional articles. And then to make sure, because as I said, these habitats have a lot of different names, and globally even more. And so we searched the citations within any article that was included to kind of snowball that out and just drag in all that available literature. And that resulted in 31 published articles, as well as one unpublished reference that was repeatedly referred to in the published literature. So we went ahead and included that. So first, I'm going to review the most common approaches that we found in the literature for restoring these habitats for amphibian conservation. Now, the majority of projects did include hydrological restoration to manage wetland hydro periods. So either extending or shortening those hydro periods. Most of the articles did focus on extending hydro periods because, as I mentioned, many of these wetlands were filled in. So they would be upland or very short hydro periods at the point of needing restoration. This included plugging of ditches, removal of berms, dikes, or subsurface drainage tiles, sometimes sediment removal, which requires heavy equipment, and upland plant management. Things like prescribed fire, grazing, and planting or removal of plants can actually influence the amount of water and overland flow that fills these unique habitats that are mainly driven by precipitation. In some cases, liners or barriers to prevent outflow of water, as well as water supplementation, were used to protect critical amphibian populations, but those methods aren't actually restoration, but I mentioned them because they were in the literature. Vegetation was also a frequent restoration target because of its effects on both the structural wetland environment and its effect on wetland function via light and nutrient input. Due to their smaller size, many degraded geographically isolated wetlands are overgrown. So methods included mechanical removal of plants, things like tree felling or mulching to open the canopy, sediment removal to eliminate propagals, particularly when those were invasive plants, prescribed fire and herbicide, all to reduce vegetation cover within a wetland. In other wetlands, revegetation was used, particularly in surrounding uplands. And often this was undergone to improve water quality and habitat. This was a frequent method for prairie pothole wetlands. In some cases, degradation was the result of or contributed to failure of ecological processes, which maintain healthy geographic isolated wetlands. For instance, those drying cycles can help eliminate fish predators that can be introduced during particularly wet years. So reintroducing drying artificially could eliminate fish populations. Historical fires or other disturbance can limit vegetation growth within wetland basins. So some projects also included methods to mimic or restore disturbance processes, including things like prescribed fire, grazing, and as I mentioned, predator management, such as fish removal. Often restoration of these ecological processes required management at the landscape scale. And for many amphibians, aquatic and terrestrial habitats are unique but complementary habitats. In fact, for most of our pond breeding amphibians, as I mentioned, they breed in wetlands, the young develop, and then they actually move up into the uplands where they grow and develop into breeding adults. So both habitats are required to support healthy populations. So we need uplands with abundant natural vegetation and connectivity to both near and more distant wetlands. Few projects actually explicitly considered this a really important landscape context. But I will say that those that did included directed wetland and upland combined treatments and had an explicit consideration of the terrestrial habitat. For example, things like landscape scale prescribed burn plans that rotate exposure to fire, both between the wetlands and the uplands, considering connectivity to other nearby or distant wetlands and the upland habitat that connects them. Another example is considering the heterogeneity in wetland hydro periods. I mentioned that these wetlands have those frequent wetting and drying cycles. However, not every wetland has the same hydro period. Some are quite short and some are longer, and everything in between. So providing a variety of habitats can buffer amphibian populations from a wetlands failure, either doing a very, very dry year or a very wet year, which introduces fish. And the last thing would be the abundance of wetlands at a broader scale. So looking beyond the pond. Some of those studies also included wetland creation to maintain those connectivity and heterogeneity goals. Of course, what we really want to know, and why you're all here in this webinar today, is to find out if restoration works, if it benefits amphibian populations, and if it's a good conservation method for amphibian populations. And I am happy to say that most amphibian-centric restoration projects in geographically isolated wetlands have reported positive outcomes. Now, the metrics that were used to evaluate success varied quite widely among different studies, but restoration can lead to increased amphibian occupancy, so whether frogs are using a particular pond, their abundance, so the number of frogs that are using the pond, or species richness, so the number of different species that are coming and using this pond. As a quick side note, this is a bunch of different pond breeding amphibians, some of which are common and some of which are threatened and endangered. Another positive outcome is that there was no indication that restoration outcomes depended on wetland type, so in the playas or vernal pools or lime sinks. So it didn't matter. Restoration was apparently equally effective regardless of wetland type or the location of that wetland globally. However, the literature is currently heavily skewed towards northern temperate climates, so particularly North America and Europe. And I fully admit this is likely the result of publication bias. So I'm strongly encouraging all practitioners and researchers particularly in other areas of the globe, to share those amphibian-centric restoration results so that we can better evaluate how transferable these different methods may or may not be to benefit amphibian conservation. Now, regarding the most successful methods, we did find that successful restoration was often associated with restoring both hydrology and vegetation. So what you're seeing here are some pictures of either restoration methods or the results of them. So this picture, let me get my pen here, or laser pointer. So this top picture, this is dredging. So they're removing material from the wetland to increase the hydro period. These are drainage tiles that I was mentioning earlier that farmers would put in to drain a particularly wet area and convert a wetland to an upland. And here they're plugging this drainage ditch, which was used for the same purpose, to drain the wetland off. And on the right-hand side here, we have some vegetation methods. So here they're felling trees that are growing inside the wetland to increase the light availability, and that also increases hydro period because trees act like giant straws and they suck up a lot of the water, which then is taken out of the wetland via evaporation. And so felling trees can also increase your hydro period. So these two are connected. Our middle picture is some vegetation replanting on the edge of a wetland. And the bottom picture is some spraying of the invasive Phragmites to eliminate it from a wetland. Now, the projects with the best outcomes for amphibians included multiple targets and used multiple methods, as well as included that landscape scale consideration or treatment that I was mentioning earlier. This means that specific individual methods were less important than a holistic approach where wetlands were treated as integral components of an upland wetland system. And if there's one thing that I would like you to take away from this webinar, that's what it is. When you're considering or planning restoration of a wetland, move beyond the pond. Look at the greater landscape, try and include multiple ponds and that terrestrial surrounding landscape if you want to have success for amphibians. Unfortunately, there are some limitations to these findings. So first, it's actually quite challenging to evaluate the overall success of these restoration efforts for amphibian conservation. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that variation in those metrics that are used to assess the amphibian response that I mentioned, that makes it difficult to compare across studies. So this includes variation in the actual metric that was used. So think about trying to compare an egg mass count to a richness metric, as well as the spatial and temporal extent of the data. Reference types also varied considerably from the gold standard pre and post data collection from restored wetlands to reference wetlands that were in degraded to excellent condition. So as you can imagine, comparing amongst those studies would be quite challenging. Some studies also assessed the amphibian response immediately following restoration for just a few years, while others failed to collect any amphibian data until many years post-restoration. So amphibians are what's known as a very spotty or erratic breeders. So some years they will have really good breeding and the next year they will not. So it's really unpredictable. And so for assessing an amphibian response, we need a longer time period than most people are collecting data, and it needs to be a more continuous projection. So these issues combined with the unpredictability of amphibian reproduction just adds to that complexity in determining the effectiveness of wetland restoration for conserving amphibians. But we do see some hope, so that is good. Now, to address these challenges and build upon past successes, we recommend that wetland restoration practitioners as I mentioned, integrate those landscape scale factors during those planning stages. So can I do something in the upland as well? Is there a nearby wetland that is complementary to this wetland? Or is there a nearby source wetland that's very healthy that can serve as a place for amphibians to migrate from to this new wetland that we're restoring? Incorporating multiple restoration methods or targets. Those studies that were most effective always included more than one target. The more they included, the more successful they were. And again, if they used the landscape scale, those were always the most successful overall, both for the overall restoration, but also for amphibian conservation. I would also recommend utilizing adaptive management when that's feasible. And that's just simply a process where you create your plan, you do your plan, but then you learn from your plan and you adjust as you go. So say you have completed your restoration plan and you've checked a couple of years, there's no amphibians. That's the time to go back and do some assessing and learn from your mistakes or whatever you did, and see what can I do differently? How can we get those amphibians here? Additionally, to improve our ability to determine how successful restoration is for amphibians, we recommend that practitioners report their amphibian outcomes for restoration projects and research. That may mean partnering up with someone else who is an amphibian biologist to get that work done. And I will say, I put a little plug in for citizen science, can be very useful for doing those amphibian outcomes. Things like call surveys or DipNet surveys are quite easy for citizen scientists to collaborate with you on. If you have an amphibian biologist or are an amphibian biologist, up the ante on the data you're collecting and include recruitment success or population persistent metrics. So call surveys and presence is nice, but knowing that we have adults that come, that breed, that those tadpoles turn into young, and that those young return as adults to breed again is much more good evidence that the population is actually doing well in that wetland. And for that, of course, you would need to extend your monitoring timelines beyond the standard of 5 years, which I know everyone is always, raising the flag about that, but I have to do it too. For researchers, they can also build on our current knowledge base by increasing their focus on the response of amphibians to restoration, as well as expanding their research questions and metrics to the broader landscape scale. We're actually doing quite well with knowing how well amphibians are doing in a particular pond, but at the landscape scale, that starts to break down. And so more research in that avenue would be really useful. We also need research that links restoration treatment to mechanisms. So I have a cute little graphic here where we have a pond full of Phragmites, and then we have a nice pond with lots of different diverse plants, and now there's a lot more frogs. But what's driving that response? Is it a compound in the plant, the invasive plant? Is it increased light? Is it increased food availability? So those kinds of mechanisms are needed to be able to make restoration more transferable. Additionally, we encourage researchers and practitioners to move beyond the pond and approach wetland research with the goal of supporting a self-sustaining system, as well as improving the resilience of that system to perturbations from urbanization, climate change, or other environmental change. And lastly, because amphibians are so unpredictable in their breeding, looking to improve methods for predicting long-term trends in amphibian populations will improve our ability to connect wetland restoration with improvements in amphibian population metrics and conservation. And just to show you an example of that, this is one graph from the Greenberg et al. Paper in 2018. This particular frog is the southern toad, and they looked at how long it would take to get to a sufficient level of confidence. So what you're looking at on your y-axis here is your confidence in the metric you're looking at. And the gold standard is usually 0.8. And on the x-axis, what we're looking at is how much change in that population. So this would represent, the pink circle would represent a 5% change in that population, either up or down. And if you scroll up to the 5-year scenario, we've only got less than 50-50 chance of being able to detect that change if we monitor a single pond for 5 years. If you're wondering what this nice, almost 100% line is, that's 23 years of data with 7 pooled wetlands. So again, at a landscape scale. So there's clearly some room for improvement here so that we can answer questions about amphibians before it is too late. So I'm going to end there because I want to have plenty of time for questions. And I want to thank everyone for your time and attention. And I hope you have some good questions.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was awesome.
Good. Let's see. I'm opening the Q&A now. And I guess you can also look at the chat.
Yeah, let's see here. I don't see, are you seeing any on your end?
I am not seeing any questions. So if anyone has a question, go ahead and pop that into the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen there. Nope, something popped up. That's okay. So that's a good question. Thank you, Melissa. Melissa is asking if there was a difference between frogs and salamanders or any life history characteristics. So I would say that is a great question that I would love to be able to answer. But if you can imagine, this was a pretty extensive drag to try and find as many possible studies, and it still was only 30. So I don't think at this time that there's enough people reporting their amphibian outcomes to answer that question. So it's an excellent question. And I think that's one, Melissa, that people in the future who are doing this kind of work need to focus on. Guess I have to hit that. Okay. There we go.
We can give it a couple more minutes to see if anyone.
Yeah, that's fine. And
Yeah.
of course, if anyone has questions that they think of later, that's always what happens to me. I think of a great question later in the day. Feel free to send those and we can get those answered.
And we also will be having this webinar. It has been recorded and it will be going on our YouTube channel, just in case anyone wants to share it with like friends or colleagues that weren't able to make it today. Well, should we call it?
Yes. Oh, what was somebody? We got one.
Perfect.
Just at the last second. So someone is asking if Phragmites seems pretty hardy and difficult to remove from a wetland system. What ways, mechanical, chemical, etc., have you seen that work the best? It's a put answer live. Okay. So that's a really great question. I will tell you, Phragmites is especially difficult to remove. I'm working in a wetland right now in New York that it took them 2 years, herbicide application multiple times a year, as well as disking to break up and expose the roots, because it can pop up from little fragments, to eliminate Phragmites. That wetland, I wouldn't say it's completely gone, but it is very beautiful now. They did reseed afterwards, so that's a good point. You can't just get rid of something; you have to put something else there, or it's just going to take up the spot again. And it's very, very spotty. The Phragmites in that wetland is very spotty now. So that is a very intensive effort. But that's probably with Phragmites what it's going to take, because of its particular life history, its ability to just grow from those small root fragments. You just have to hit it again and again. Great question, though. We have another question. My research focuses on constructed or engineered wetlands. Is there a difference in ability to restore an isolated wetland versus an engineered one in amphibian presence? That's a great question. What we were seeing is that, yes, there's a difference, but constructed wetlands are definitely effective for amphibian conservation. And there's another really great review paper that talks just about created wetlands. And I wish I could remember off the top of my head the author of that, but I cannot. But if you should be able to find it by just Googling, constructed wetland effectiveness or something similar. It's fairly recent, and it's very, very well done. And it's similar, where they looked at all the constructed wetlands and how effective they were. So good question. I would take the caveat, though, that a constructed wetland is never going to be the same as a non-constructed wetland. And when you have a choice, it is probably always better to improve an existing habitat. But done in conjunction, that is definitely a good method to include in the toolbox. We can be patient for a few more minutes.
For sure. Yeah, no rush. I work with constructed treatment wetlands at my job out in California, and we are like in a suburban environment. So I've been trying to look at like the buffer zones around these constructed wetlands to like kind of extend the habitat to like the very farthest edges that we can.
Yeah.
So that was interesting part of your talk. I'm like, okay, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
not just the aquatic habitat, but like the kind of like riparian-ish habitat around it.
Yeah, and forest. So a lot of our amphibians, they want to live in forests. So that's why you'll find in urbanized habitats very specific species that don't mind backyards. So that, it is a big consideration with wetlands when you're thinking about amphibians, not just the other functions of a wetland, because amphibians most of our amphibians are not aquatic completely. It's just a breeding habitat and a nursery for them. And so they need that upland habitat to forage, to grow, to mature. And then they come back and forth. So it is important. If your goal is frogs or salamanders, then you need to include that upland habitat.
Yeah. Yeah. What do we think?
I think that we can probably let people go unless they are just about to have a burning question. Hit enter quickly if
Perfect.
you do.
Thank you guys all for joining. We will continue to do lunch and learns, and please contact me anytime that if you would like to present or have someone that should be presenting, you think, wise@irwd.com, and it's also online. But yeah, thank you very much, Angela. That was awesome. I
Well,
appreciate
thank
it.
you for having me. I enjoyed coming. So have a
Awesome.
good day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.